Week 14 of the fantasy football season is already here, and that means it's likely your final chance to sew up that playoff berth for your fantasy football season. There's 6 teams on bye and a ton of new injuries, and that's why I'm bringing in Michael Fabiano, our senior fantasy analyst at Sports Illustrated. Okay, Fabs, really important. We make the best starts possible this week. Let's kick it off at the quarterback position. You like Kirk Cousins and Jared Goff, who may even be available on the waiver wire.
Yeah, and they're 2 teams playing against one another, and neither has been good against quarterbacks. So Kirk Cousins, we told you to sit him last week, and he had an absolute stink bomb against the Jets. But this is a really good matchup against the Detroit Lions. Number one, the Lions have given up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Number two, Cousins has scored 18 plus points against the Lions in 6 of his last 9 meetings against them, including 18.3 in a game back in week 3. So start Kirk Cousins, and don't be afraid to start Goff. Listen, Goff's been really good at Ford Field. In fact, only once at home has he failed to throw multiple touchdown passes, and the Vikings defense has allowed 8 quarterbacks to score 17 plus points, including 4 who've gone over 20. So I get it. It's weird to be trusting Jared Goff going into the fantasy postseason. I mean, you've got one more week before it all is on the line, but he's been pretty good at home, and the matchup is right.
That game is the highest game total over at SI Sportsbook as well, so I totally dig it. Let's talk about who we're going to sit at the quarterback position. Deshaun Watson didn't look quite up to his standards, I would say, in last week's matchup. And Tom Brady, though he did pull off the last-minute win in Monday Night Football, again, I don't know that you can trust him.
Yeah, he had a couple of touchdown passes in the fourth quarter and still didn't score 18 points. Tom Brady and that Buccaneers offense is broken. I don't know what's going on with it. I don't know what the Saints were thinking. But bottom line here is that Tom Brady is not a reliable asset anymore. And he's got the Niners. They've allowed just 2 quarterbacks to score more than 17.4 points against them this season. And one of them was Patrick Mahomes. Like, this is a very, very good defense. So keep that in mind. Tom Brady is a fade for me. And you mentioned Deshaun Watson. And I know a lot of people were like, well, I held on to him this long. Why can't I play him? Well, last week, bit of a stinker, and that's an understatement. The Browns offense didn't score a touchdown with Watson under center. And now you got the Bengals, all right? Their defense has allowed just 11 touchdown passes and fewer than 14 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Like, did you look at Patrick Mahomes' numbers last week? They were not good. The Bengals have a really good offense, but an underrated defense. So I would certainly beware Deshaun Watson, even in 2 QB leagues.
Let's move over to the running back position, where you like one of our Dallas Cowboys, Tony Pollard, versus, of course, the Houston run defense in a battle of the Lone Star State on Sunday.
He was my start of the week last week, and I said, you know what, it worked out, Jen. Let's do it again, right? I mean, let's double it up. Houston's defense is terrible against the run, although Nick Chubb, I mean, what happened last week? That was just unbelievably bad. But I'm going to stick with the Cowboys, and you can start Zeke Elliott this week too with 6 teams on a bye. Remember, worst defense in the league in terms of stopping running backs. Pollard had a near 26% touch share last week. You could start him, and again, Zeke. And then let's talk about DeAndre Swift. It looks like there's been a changing of the guard there last week. He led the backfield in snaps, in touches, in red zone looks, and in fantasy points ahead of Jamal Williams. This week, he's got the Vikings. This should be a high-scoring game, and they've been bad against running backs. In fact, they've surrendered 6 touchdowns and the second most fantasy points to the position since week 10.
And of course, DeAndre Swift, especially valuable in those PPR leagues, so fire him up. All right, moving over to who we're going to sit at the running back position. You do not like the running back on Houston's side of the Dallas game for this weekend. And Najee Harris, you're also saying, not this week.
Yeah, let's start off with Dameon Pierce, who had a decent game last week, 12.5 points, but that was against a bad Browns run defense. In his previous 2 games, he was terrible because, well, game script. And guess what's going to happen this week? Game script. That's right. The Cowboys are going to boat race the Texans. They're not going to be able to run the football for 4 quarters. This is a game where I would avoid Pierce at all costs. But here's the problem. We've got 6 teams on a bye, Jen. So when you look at my sit-em running backs this week, take it with a grain of salt, because I know a lot of these players are going to have to be started out of necessity. You mentioned Najee Harris. He fits into that category as well. He's looked better lately, But outside of that one big game against Cincinnati, he still hasn't put up massive fantasy points. And the Ravens have allowed 1 touchdown and the 5th fewest fantasy points to running backs in the last 4 weeks. So the matchup's not great either. Again, Harris is probably going to be an RB2 flex this week, but temper expectations.
That Baltimore game also has the lowest game total of the week at SI Sportsbook. All right, pivoting over to the wide receiver position now. Garrett Wilson was phenomenal last weekend. I hope you had him in your DFS lineups. He was a great mid-tier value, and he won a few contests for me. And then Christian Kirk, your other start of last week, also did right by us.
And Wilson was my start of the week last week. And again, much like Tony Pollard, let's do it again, right? I mean, people are going to look at this matchup, Jen, and think, wait a minute, this is the Bills. This is not a good matchup. But over the last 4 weeks, their defense has allowed the 4th most points to perimeter receivers. And remember back in week 9, Garrett Wilson scored almost 18 points against Buffalo. So continue to start him. And Christian Kirk will double up with him too. Last week, he was one of my starts. He had a really good game, 104 yards receiving. Now he's got the Titans. This is a defense that has been very generous to wide receivers, 17 touchdown catches. Zay Jones also worth a look maybe in DFS or in deeper leagues if you really need a wide receiver, but a very good matchup for the Jaguars wideouts against Tennessee.
Gabe Davis and Juju Smith-Schuster are in 2 very high-powered offenses, but you say this week is not the week to give them a start.
Gabe he's schizophrenic in the stat sheets, right? I mean, you can't trust him. It's hard to sit him because you never know when you're going to get that big game from him. But I mean, look at the numbers. He has been absolutely inconsistent, single-digit points in 4 of his last 6 games. Now he's got the Jets. Hey, folks, the Jets' defense is really good. They held them to 5.3 points earlier in the season. So Gabe Davis is going to be on my bench. And you mentioned Juju. Remember a few weeks ago he was really hot? Lately, he has been ice cold. 18.6 combined fantasy points in his last 3 games. And as bad as Denver's offense is, their defense is really good. And it's very tough. They've actually allowed just 6 touchdowns and the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So Juju is a risk. Now, once again, 6 teams off. You're probably going to have to play a lot of these players I'm telling you to sit, but temper those expectations.
You know, the under has hit in 11 of 12 Broncos games this year, and it's not just because Russ is so bad. It's also because the defense is so good. But that's a pretty astounding stat. The under has hit on the 11 of 12 games. Unbelievable. Okay, moving to the tight end position, Gerald, Everett, and Hunter Henry. I'm assuming it's because it's versus the Cardinals.
Right, and we'll start off with Everett, who had a good game last week, 13 fantasy points. It was a high-scoring game. I thought it would be more high-scoring, I guess, for the Chargers on that side. But the tight end position's a nightmare. Everett's going to be a top 10 player out of necessity this week. The Dolphins have given up 10-plus fantasy points to 8 tight ends, including 2 who've gone over 20. This should be a high-scoring game at SoFi. Start Gerald Everett. And you mentioned Hunter Henry. This isn't about Hunter Henry being great because he hasn't been. I mean, he's failed to score double digits in all but 2 games this season. He's been really bad, actually, but it's the Cardinals. Their defense has allowed 10-plus fantasy points to 10 tight ends, including 5 who've gone over 17 points. So Hunter Henry's on the waiver wire too, Jen. You could pick him up and play him if you're desperate at that position. And trust me, people are desperate at this position.
I know I am in 1 or 2 leagues, I have to admit it. As far as who we're sitting at the tight end position, you're sitting Dawson Knox despite the fact that he is in that fantastic Buffalo Bills offense. But more importantly, you're sitting the tight end too from week 13. That's how bad it is, guys. Noah Fant.
Dawson Knox, this is like a rage sit. Everybody started him last week. He had nothing. 0. Zip. Zilch. Bupkis. You get my point. And now he's got the Jets. Again, I mean, the Jets defense is really good. The last time they faced off back in week 9, Knox had 5.5 points. He's touchdown dependent, and the Jets don't give up touchdowns to tight ends. So beware Dawson Knox. And you mentioned Noah Fant. I was wrong about him last week. I thought he'd have a bad game. He was actually really good. But think about it. How many games has Noah Fant really produced good numbers in the stat sheets? Also keep this in mind. This is a player who needs to get into the end zone to actually have a good stat line, right? Fant hasn't had more than 7.9 points in a game where he hasn't scored. Guess how many touchdowns the Panthers have given up to tight ends this year? 3. That's it. So Noah Fant is a fade or a desperation low-end tight end 1 at best.
Great advice as always, Fabs. If you're looking to make it all the way through your fantasy playoffs and hoist that championship trophy, stay with us here at SI.com. Hit that subscribe button and don't forget to check us out, SI.com/fantasy.